If you only looked at Ken Dryden for a few seconds, you probably would not have picked him as the most intimidating player on the ice. He rarely raised his voice. He almost never celebrated a save. He did not chase headlines, start fights, or play with the swagger that many stars of his era carried. Yet somehow, when the puck crossed center, then the play moved toward Montreal's end, the confidence of some of the greatest scorers in hockey quietly began to disappear. Why did Phil Esposito admit that scoring against Dryden demanded near-perfect execution every single time? Why did Bobby Orr, a player who controlled games better than almost anyone in NHL history, repeatedly run into a goaltender who always seemed one step ahead? Why did the Montreal Canadiens place the pressure of an entire Stanley Cup run on a rookie who had barely appeared in the National Hockey League? And why more than 50 years later do players and coaches still describe Ken Dryden as one of the most mentally overwhelming goaltenders the game has ever produced? The truth was never fully told. People often remember his size, his famous mask, or the championships that followed. Those things mattered. But they were never what unsettled opponents the most. The real challenge was trying to beat someone who looked completely untouched by pressure. Every movement appeared deliberate. Every save looked expected. Every mistake shooters hoped to force simply never came. His reputation traveled faster than the puck. Long before sports psychology became part of hockey, Ken Dryden was already winning battles inside the minds of elite NHL players. They knew his reach was enormous. They respected his positioning. But what truly stayed with them was the feeling that he had already solved the play before they even released the shot. That quiet certainty became one of the most powerful forms of dominance the National Hockey League has ever witnessed. Why shooters felt there was no net? When people try to explain why Ken Dryden was so difficult to score against, the first thing they usually mention is his size. At 6 feet 4 inches, he was one of the biggest goaltenders in the National Hockey League during the early 1970s. His long arms and equally long legs naturally covered more of the net than most goalies of his era. But anyone who actually played against him will tell you that his height was only the beginning of the story. Dryden never depended on athletic desperation. He did not throw himself across the crease looking for miraculous saves. He believed that if a goaltender constantly needed spectacular recoveries, something had already gone wrong. Instead, he trusted positioning above everything else. He studied shooting angles, anticipated passing lanes, and arrived at the right spot before the puck did. As a result, many saves looked surprisingly ordinary. The reality was that they had been created long before the shot was released. That approach frustrated even the league's greatest offensive players. Phil Esposito, one of the most prolific goal scorers in NHL history, often spoke about the challenge of facing Dryden during the fierce Boston Bruins and Montreal Canadiens rivalry. Esposito explained that Dryden's size forced shooters to aim for extremely small openings, but his patience made those openings disappear before the puck arrived. The longer a player hesitated, the larger Dryden seemed to become. His movements reflected remarkable discipline. While many goaltenders reacted immediately to every fake or shoulder movement, Dryden stayed on his edges longer than almost anyone else. He refused to commit until absolutely necessary. Opponents frequently believed they had pulled him out of position, only to discover that he had never actually lost balance in the first place. His economy of movement created an illusion that nothing happening around him was unexpected. Former Canadiens coach Scotty Bowman admired that quality more than almost any physical attribute. Bowman often emphasized that Dryden never wasted energy. Every movement had a purpose. Every adjustment was calculated. Rather than chasing the game, he controlled its rhythm from inside the crease. That calm decision-making gave confidence to the entire Montreal defensive unit because they knew their goaltender would rarely create unnecessary chaos behind them. Teammates noticed the same pattern during practices. Larry Robinson later recalled that Dryden's greatest strength was not making impossible saves. It was making difficult saves appear routine. Defensemen quickly learned that if they simply forced opponents toward lower percentage areas, Dryden would already be waiting. There was very little panic in his game, and that steadiness spread throughout the entire lineup. Another reason shooters struggled against him was his ability to read body language. Dryden watched hand stick, position, shoulder rotation, and even the smallest change in skating stride before the puck left the blade. Those subtle details often revealed a player's intentions earlier than most people realized. Years before advanced video analysis became common, Dryden was effectively processing information in real time and making decisions that looked almost effortless. Opponents frequently described a strange psychological effect after facing him several times. The net itself did not physically shrink, yet it somehow felt smaller. Players started aiming too precisely, trying to beat corners that barely existed. Others released shots earlier than they wanted because they feared waiting another fraction of a second. Those tiny changes were exactly what Dryden wanted. He rarely forced mistakes through aggression. He allowed doubt to create them naturally. That was what made Ken Dryden different from many dominant goaltenders of his generation. He did not need to look dangerous. He simply removed every comfortable option a shooter believed he had. By the time the puck finally left the stick, the battle had often already been decided. When Montreal realized they had something different, the Montreal Canadiens had been watching Ken Dryden long before most hockey fans had ever heard his name. While he was building an outstanding career at Cornell University, general manager Sam Pollock believed the organization had found far more than another promising goaltending prospect. Dryden did not fit the usual profile of a young player chasing attention. He was older than many rookies because of his college career, highly educated, remarkably composed, and completely comfortable carrying responsibility. Pollock saw someone whose greatest strength could not be measured on a score sheet. He saw a mind capable of thriving under pressure that overwhelmed other players. The Canadiens selected Dryden in the 1964 NHL amateur draft, but they allowed him to remain at Cornell and continue his education. That patience proved valuable. Instead of rushing into professional hockey, Dryden matured physically and mentally while facing high-level collegiate competition. By the time Montreal called him to the NHL late in the 1970 and 1971 season, he already possessed the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly that opportunity. His arrival could hardly have come under more unusual circumstances. Dryden appeared in only 6 regular season NHL games before the Stanley Cup playoffs began. 6 games. Most organizations would never consider handing playoff responsibilities to a goaltender with so little professional experience. Yet inside the Canadiens organization, there was growing belief that this quiet newcomer possessed something special. Coaches saw it in practice. Veterans saw it in training sessions. Even when facing some of hockey's greatest shooters, Dryden never looked overwhelmed. The real test arrived immediately. In the opening round of the 1971 Stanley Cup playoffs, Montreal faced the Boston Bruins, defending Stanley Cup champions and arguably the strongest team in hockey. Boston had finished the regular season with an extraordinary 121 points and featured perhaps the most feared offensive lineup in the league. Bobby Orr was redefining the defense position. Phil Esposito had scored 76 goals during the regular season, an NHL record at the time. Johnny Bucyk remained one of hockey's most respected veterans. Nearly everyone expected Boston to eliminate the inexperienced Canadiens without serious difficulty. Instead, they ran into Ken Dryden. Throughout the series, Dryden displayed a level of calm that seemed almost impossible for a rookie. Boston attacked relentlessly, creating sustained offensive pressure that had broken countless goaltenders before him. Yet Dryden refused to chase the puck or allow the pace of the series to dictate his decisions. Time after time, he absorbed dangerous chances with controlled positioning rather than desperation. His rebounds stayed manageable. His movements remained economical. Most importantly, his confidence never appeared to change, regardless of how much pressure surrounded him. Phil Esposito later acknowledged how frustrating Dryden became during that series. Boston generated opportunities that normally resulted in goals, but Dryden consistently denied them without appearing spectacular. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. He was not stealing games through impossible acrobatic saves. He simply looked prepared for everything the Bruins attempted. The defining moment came in Game 2 at the Boston Garden. Facing one of the greatest offensive teams ever assembled, Dryden stopped 44 shots in a brilliant performance that stunned both the crowd and the hockey world. The Canadiens eventually eliminated the heavily favored Bruins in 7 games, one of the biggest playoff upsets of the era. Suddenly, the conversation around Ken Dryden changed forever. Inside NHL circles, coaches, and executives quickly reached the same conclusion. This was no ordinary rookie. The league had spent years preparing for dominant scorers and physical defensemen. It was far less prepared for a goaltender whose greatest weapon was complete emotional control. Dryden had not intimidated Boston with aggression or theatrics. He had done something far more unsettling. He made one of the greatest teams in hockey history question whether their best offense was actually enough. That was the moment many inside the National Hockey League realized they were witnessing the arrival of a completely different kind of goaltender. His reputation was no longer built on potential. It had been earned against the strongest possible opponent. From that spring forward, Ken Dryden was no longer simply a talented young goalie. He had become someone elite players genuinely dreaded facing. The quiet man, nobody questioned. Walking into the Montreal Canadiens locker room in the early 1970s meant entering one of the most demanding environments in professional sports. This was not an ordinary hockey team. It was an organization built on championships expectations, and a culture where respect had to be earned every single day. Veterans like Jean Beliveau-Henry, Richard Serge Savard, Jacques Lemaire, Guy Lapointe, and later Guy Lafleur carried enormous influence. Young players usually spent years proving they belonged before their voices carried any weight. Ken Dryden never tried to change that culture. He never attempted to become the loudest person in the room. In fact, teammates often described him as one of the quietest. Yet somehow, almost immediately, everyone listened. His authority never came from speeches. It came from preparation. Long before the first puck dropped, Dryden had already completed the routines that gave him confidence. While many players relied on emotion before important games, Dryden relied on consistency. He stretched the same way. He dressed the same way. He approached every game with the same calm expression, whether it was an October regular season contest or Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. That consistency had a powerful effect inside the locker room because hockey players notice everything. They notice nervous habits. They notice changes in body language. They notice when someone begins to doubt himself. They never saw that from Ken Dryden. Scotty Bowman later explained that one of Dryden's greatest qualities was the confidence he quietly gave everyone else. Coaches never had to wonder whether their goaltender would be emotionally ready. Defensemen never felt pressure to play outside the team's structure because they trusted the man behind them. Dryden's calmness became contagious. The entire defensive group played with greater patience because they believed their goaltender would be exactly where he needed to be. Larry Robinson often spoke about that trust. As one of the greatest defensemen in NHL history, Robinson understood that elite defensive hockey depended on communication without panic. Dryden rarely shouted instructions. He rarely displayed frustration after a goal against. If mistakes happened, he simply reset and prepared for the next sequence. That attitude prevented one bad shift from turning into several bad shifts, something that often separates championship teams from everyone else. There was another reason players respected him so deeply. Dryden never asked teammates to match an effort he was unwilling to give himself. Every practice reflected the same discipline he showed during games. He studied shooters carefully, welcomed difficult drills, and constantly worked on positioning rather than searching for spectacular moments. Younger players quickly realized that one of the biggest stars on the team prepared with remarkable humility. Veterans appreciated it because they knew professionalism when they saw it. Several former teammates later recalled that Dryden's intelligence stood out almost as much as his goaltending. Conversations with him rarely focused only on hockey. He could discuss history, politics, law, or current events with the same curiosity he brought to reading an opposing power play. That broader perspective earned enormous respect inside the Canadiens organization. Players understood they were sharing a locker room with someone who viewed hockey differently from almost everyone else. Perhaps the best example of Dryden's influence came during the pressure-filled playoff runs that defined Montreal's dynasty. Before crucial games, many locker rooms become louder. Players pace across the floor. Equipment is adjusted repeatedly. Conversations become shorter. Anxiety slowly spreads from one corner of the room to another. Dryden rarely changed. He sat quietly. He gathered his thoughts. He prepared exactly as he always had. That unwavering routine became a signal to everyone else that nothing had changed simply because the stakes were higher. Serge Savard later reflected that confidence inside great teams often begins with the goaltender. When teammates believe their last line of defense cannot be rattled, they naturally become more aggressive and more confident themselves. Dryden created that feeling without demanding attention. His presence alone stabilized the room. Opponents sensed it too. Players from rival teams frequently commented that Montreal never appeared to panic even when trailing in playoff games. Much of that confidence started with the man standing in the crease. They knew their goaltender would not lose emotional control. That certainty spread through every line, changed every defensive shift and every critical moment. Ken Dryden never ruled the Canadiens' locker room through fear. He ruled it through absolute composure. And that quiet confidence became one of the most intimidating qualities any player in the National Hockey League had ever witnessed. The greatest players all said the same thing. Respect in the National Hockey League is difficult to earn, especially from players who spend their careers trying to beat you. Goals can be forgotten. Championships eventually become history. But when Hall of Fame players continue talking about a goaltender decades after retiring, it usually means that player left something much deeper than statistics behind. That was exactly what happened with Ken Dryden. The remarkable thing was that the stories sounded surprisingly similar even when they came from different generations, different teams, and different personalities. They were not describing a violent player. They were not talking about trash talk or intimidation tactics. They were describing someone who quietly changed the way they thought whenever they entered the offensive zone. Phil Esposito experienced that reality better than almost anyone. During the early 1970s, Esposito was arguably the most feared goal scorer in hockey. He won multiple Art Ross and Hart trophies, broke scoring records, and became the centerpiece of the Boston Bruins' explosive offense. Against most goaltenders, Esposito attacked with confidence around the crease, trusting his instincts and exceptional hand-eye coordination. Against Dryden, things felt different. Esposito later admitted that Dryden forced shooters to be almost perfect. His enormous frame eliminated obvious openings, but his greatest strength was refusing to commit too early. Many goaltenders reacted to the first fake. Dryden waited for the second, sometimes even the third. By then, the scoring chance had already disappeared. Esposito often generated excellent opportunities against Montreal, yet somehow the puck kept finding Dryden's equipment instead of the back of the net. Looking back years later, he acknowledged that Dryden's patience often frustrated elite scorers into trying shots they normally would not attempt. Bobby Orr recognized another side of Dryden's game. As perhaps the greatest defenseman the sport has ever produced, Orr saw hockey differently from almost everyone else. His skating allowed him to create offensive chances that seemed impossible. He understood timing, spacing, and passing angles at an extraordinary level. Even so, Dryden consistently challenged those instincts. Orr later spoke about how composed Dryden remained under relentless pressure. No matter how quickly Boston moved the puck or how dangerous the attack became, Dryden rarely abandoned his structure. Instead of reacting emotionally to the speed of the game, he trusted his positioning and forced even brilliant offensive players to search for solutions that often were not there. That level of discipline earned Orr's admiration because he understood how difficult it actually was. Inside the Canadiens' dressing room, the respect was equally powerful. Serge Savard often emphasized that Dryden's intelligence separated him from nearly every other goaltender. It was not simply about stopping pucks. It was about understanding the rhythm of an entire hockey game. Dryden recognized when to freeze the puck, when to move it quickly, and when to allow his teammates a few extra seconds to recover after long defensive shifts. Those decisions rarely appeared on highlight reels, yet they influenced countless games throughout Montreal's dynasty. Larry Robinson admired something else. He believed Dryden's greatest gift was emotional consistency. Whether Montreal led by 4 goals or trailed by 1 in the third period, Dryden's body language barely changed. Defensemen never looked back and wondered if their goaltender had lost confidence. They always saw the same calm posture waiting behind them. That stability allowed the Canadiens to play aggressively without fear of panic spreading through the lineup. Scotty Bowman perhaps summarized Dryden better than anyone. Bowman coached many legendary players throughout his extraordinary career, but he repeatedly described Dryden as one of the smartest competitors he had ever worked with. According to Bowman, Dryden prepared differently from most athletes. He constantly analyzed tendencies, remembered details from previous games, and anticipated situations before they developed. His success came from processing information faster than the players trying to beat him. Opponents gradually realized something unsettling. Dryden was not winning because he happened to make great saves. He was winning because he understood what they wanted to do before they fully committed to doing it. That realization changed behavior across the league. Some forwards began shooting earlier than usual because they feared waiting too long. Others aimed for impossible corners instead of taking high-percentage chances. Some passed when they should have shot. Others shot when they should have passed. Those decisions were rarely forced by physical pressure. They were created by psychological pressure. Dryden quietly convinced elite scorers that their first instinct might be wrong. Once doubt entered a player's mind, the advantage belonged to the goaltender. That was why respect followed him everywhere he played. Players did not fear Ken Dryden because he talked. They feared him because he almost never had to. His silence carried complete confidence. And, in the National Hockey League, confidence that never cracked was often more intimidating than any hit, any fight, or any goal ever could. The 1,971 playoffs changed everything. Every great career has a moment when reputation becomes reality. For Ken Dryden, that moment arrived during the spring of 1971. Until then, he was viewed as an intelligent prospect with tremendous potential. After those playoffs, nobody inside the National Hockey League used the word potential anymore. They used a different word: nightmare. It is almost impossible to appreciate how extraordinary the circumstances were. Dryden had appeared in only 6 regular season NHL games before entering the Stanley Cup playoffs. 6 games were hardly enough for a young goaltender to adjust to the speed of professional hockey, let alone carry one of the most famous franchises in the sport. Most rookies spend years earning trust. Dryden was suddenly expected to face the defending Stanley Cup champions. The opponent could hardly have been more intimidating. The Boston Bruins had just completed one of the greatest regular seasons in NHL history. Bobby Orr dominated every area of the ice. Phil Esposito had scored a record 76 goals. Johnny Busick remained one of the league's most dependable stars. Their offense overwhelmed opponents with speed, creativity, and relentless pressure. Almost every prediction favored Boston. Dryden ignored every prediction. From the opening face-off of the series, he played with the same calm rhythm that had defined him since college. He never looked rushed. He never chased rebounds. He never appeared overwhelmed by the moment. While thousands of fans inside Boston Garden expected the rookie to crack under pressure, Dryden simply continued reading plays exactly as he always had. The defining performance came in Game 2. Boston attacked relentlessly, generating 44 shots on goal. Time after time, the Bruins believed they had finally created the opening they wanted. Time after time, Dryden was already there. Some saves required athleticism. Most required anticipation. Instead of reacting after the puck left the stick, Dryden often seemed to arrive at the correct position before the shot even developed. The Bruins were not simply being stopped. They were being forced into questioning their own instincts. That psychological shift became more noticeable as the series continued. Players who normally shot without hesitation began looking for one extra pass. Others tried to pick impossible corners. Even the league's most dangerous scorers started overthinking situations that usually came naturally. That was exactly the advantage Dryden created. Montreal stunned Boston in 7 games, producing one of the biggest playoff upsets of the era. The victory immediately changed how coaches, players, and executives across the league viewed the young goaltender. The challenge only became greater. In the Stanley Cup final, Montreal faced the Chicago Blackhawks, another elite team led by Bobby Hull, Stan Mikita, and Tony Esposito. Once again, Dryden refused to change his approach. He remained composed through every shift, every scoring chance, and every pressure-filled moment. The Canadiens captured the Stanley Cup. Dryden was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy as the most valuable player of the playoffs, becoming one of the very few rookies in NHL history to receive that honor. It was not simply recognition for outstanding statistics. It was recognition that he had transformed the emotional balance of every series he played. By the end of that spring, something unusual had happened. The most dangerous offensive players in hockey were no longer entering games expecting to solve a young goaltender. They were entering games wondering whether they could solve him at all. That was the moment Ken Dryden stopped being a promising rookie. He became the standard every elite scorer measured himself against. And from that point forward, every time opponents saw number 29 standing quietly in the Montreal crease, they understood they were facing far more than exceptional talent. They were facing complete control. Fear was his real legacy. When people remember Ken Dryden today, they often begin with the obvious accomplishments. 6 Stanley Cups, 5 Vezina trophies, a Conn Smythe Trophy, Hall of Fame induction. Those achievements are extraordinary, but they do not fully explain why his name still carries so much weight inside hockey circles. Statistics tell us how successful a player was. They do not explain how that player changed the way other people thought. That is where Ken Dryden's legacy becomes unique. For many goaltenders who came after him, Dryden proved that domination did not have to come from spectacular athleticism or emotional intensity. It could come from intelligence, preparation, and absolute emotional control. Long before video coaches, advanced analytics, and detailed scouting reports became standard throughout the NHL, Dryden was already treating every game like a complex puzzle waiting to be solved. His influence reached beyond the Montreal Canadiens. Future generations of goaltenders studied the same qualities that opponents had feared for years: positioning instead of unnecessary movement, patience instead of panic, reading the play instead of reacting at the last possible second. Those ideas became central parts of modern goaltending, and Dryden had demonstrated their value decades earlier. What made him intimidating was never one spectacular save. It was the accumulation of hundreds of ordinary-looking saves that quietly broke an opponent's confidence. A forward would create an excellent scoring chance. Dryden stopped it. A few minutes later, another chance. Another save. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Nothing that suggested the goaltender had done anything extraordinary. Then the third period arrived, And that same scorer realized he had started aiming for places he normally would never choose. His instincts had changed. His confidence had faded. Without saying a single word, Dryden had already won the psychological battle. That was his greatest weapon. Even years after retiring from professional hockey, former players continued describing him in remarkably similar ways. They spoke about his calmness, his intelligence, his discipline. Very few talked about intimidation in the traditional sense because Dryden never tried to frighten anyone. He simply removed hope. Every shooter entered the offensive zone believing there was a solution. Dryden made that solution disappear. His career also challenged the popular belief that great competitors had to be loud personalities. Off the ice, he remained thoughtful, articulate, and deeply interested in life beyond hockey. He studied law, became an author, entered public service, and later served as president of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Those accomplishments reinforced something teammates had recognized long before the public did. Hockey was only one expression of an exceptionally analytical mind. That mind was what separated him. Many great goaltenders possessed remarkable reflexes. Many possessed outstanding athletic ability. Very few combined those gifts with Dryden's ability to process the game several seconds ahead of everyone else on the ice. That was why Hall of Fame players continued mentioning his name whenever conversations turned toward the hardest goaltenders they had ever faced. They were not remembering impossible saves. They were remembering impossible decisions. Every option they considered already seemed covered. Every shooting lane appeared smaller. Every second of hesitation favored the man standing quietly in the Montreal crease. Fear was never created by shouting. Fear was created by certainty. Ken Dryden gave opponents the unsettling feeling that their very best hockey still might not be enough. That is real dominance in hockey. He did not win fear. He earned it. Ken Dryden never needed to become the loudest player on the ice to leave one of the deepest impressions in NHL history. He did not build his reputation through fights, emotional outbursts, or intimidating speeches. Instead, he built it one calm decision at a time. Every game reinforced the same message. If you wanted to beat him, talent alone would not be enough. You had to outthink one of the smartest goaltenders the sport had ever produced. And very few players ever managed to do that consistently. His greatest victories were often invisible. They happened inside the minds of opposing forwards long before the puck reached the crease. Elite scorers began questioning shots they normally took without hesitation. Passing lanes looked smaller. Open corners seemed to disappear. Confidence slowly turned into uncertainty, and uncertainty became exactly what Dryden wanted. That psychological advantage was earned through years of preparation, discipline, and an extraordinary understanding of hockey. The achievements speak for themselves. 6 Stanley Cups, 5 Vezina trophies, a Conn Smythe trophy, after one of the greatest rookie playoff performances the NHL has ever seen. But those accomplishments are only part of the story. What truly separates Ken Dryden from many other legendary goaltenders is the respect that continues to come from the people who actually played against him. Hall of Famers who scored hundreds of goals still describe him as someone who always seemed one step ahead. Someone who never looked rattled regardless of the moment. That is why his legacy continues to grow with every generation of hockey fans. Modern goaltenders still study his positioning, his patience, and his ability to simplify the game under enormous pressure. Coaches still point to his decision-making as an example of how intelligence can become an athlete's greatest weapon. His influence reaches far beyond the statistics recorded in the history books. Fear was never created by violence. It was created by certainty. Every shooter knew that beating Ken Dryden required almost perfect execution, and even perfection was not always enough. That is what made him truly terrifying. That is real dominance in hockey. He did not demand respect. He earned it.